I'm glad you've made it here, that you're, you're not having the food coma, and you're here to listen to some excellent panelists talk about some topics related to React and React Native, and maybe some other things as well. For those of you who might be wondering who this bearded, bald guy is up here, my name is Kyle Shevlin. I'm a senior software engineer at Formidable, and I work with React and a great team. And I'm just really thankful to have a chance to be here and to get to lead this discussion with these people. It's a wonderful opportunity. I want to thank Infinite Red, specifically my buddy Jamin, for inviting me. And man, they're putting on such a great conference so far, right? Like, round of applause for that. So I'm glad this is the way that we get to start our afternoon. We get to ease into things, right? A little anecdote. Here's kind of my goal for today, and I hope you'll come in and join me in this journey a little bit. But how many of you maybe feel like you were possibly born at the wrong time in history? Sometimes I think that I was really born at the wrong time, and I was really meant to be born during the Enlightenment, and specifically, I think I was meant to live in the French salons, right? Where I found a wealthy patron that allowed me to just sit around and talk and think and somehow live doing that. But that's kind of what I'm hoping is going to happen today. We're going to invite these people up here in a second and let them introduce themselves. But what I'm hoping we get to do is I'm hoping we get to eavesdrop in on a really wonderful, hopefully some hot takes happen too, stuff to fill Twitter with, but a wonderful conversation about this topic that we have so much passion and love for. So, can you give a warm welcome to our panelists? Come on out. Come on. Everyone walk on out. I'll have you introduce yourselves in a moment. So some of you are very familiar faces to the audience, some of you not so much. So I would love it if we could start all the way at the end, but I would love it that you could introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And let's get a little extra questionnaire. What's your favorite non-coding hobby? You got to have some life outside of that laptop, right? So
yeah, right. So I'm Sanket Sahu from Geeky Ants, and we're the ones behind Native Base, BuilderX, and Vue Native. And the last question, what's my
non-coding hobby?
Coding hobby. So I play guitar. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Thank you.
Nobody's ever seen me before. Gailabord, Chief Technology Strategist of Infinite Red. I pretty much live behind a laptop because I love information, much like you're saying so. So when I get away from it, I like to build something. Usually also requires a laptop. But the thing that I will do without technology is I recycle old wine bottles into lamps.
Nice.
So yeah, a few people have some.
Very crafty. I see an Etsy store in Gant's future.
Hi, my name is David Waka. I work in the React Native core team at Facebook.
You're introducing yourself to them. Look at them.
Hi, everybody. I'm a native Android developer, so I take care of the Android side of the framework. Outside of technology, I like biking. So
all right,
I like go to the mountains and bike.
This is a great place to bike. I don't know if you know. You should come up and do some biking here in Portland. I think Chris Ball, didn't you bike all the way out to the Vista House? Are you out there?
No.
64 miles, right?
Wow, that's cool.
Hi, I'm Eric Vicente. I currently have my head in the clouds with full stack databases, open source databases, but I used to work at Facebook, both on the React Native team and a bunch of app teams. I also created React Navigation, which I think some of you people use. I'm finally happy to sort of say that I work on it. And outside of programming, I'm into robotics, and outside of technical stuff, I'm into running.
Nice. Yeah, you can keep that. They got one over here.
I got this, bro. My name's Trevor Brindle. I'm a consultant at Modus Create. We work with Node, GraphQL, React, a lot of different front-end technologies mostly. And outside of work, I'm really into music, and lately with my my very young daughter, we like to compose some, what I like to call new age music sitting at the piano. I play something that's actually real music, and she tries to play along. So.
Nice.
My name's Erica Cooksey. I'm a staff software engineer at Ease, mostly Android. And when I'm not coding, I compete in 2 sports, powerlifting and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so I spend most of my time training in those.
Do not mess with her.
I'm Jen Luker. I also work at Formidable. I spend most of my time in React, but with accessibility being one of my strong suits, I like to keep my fingers in as many technologies as possible to make sure I know what's going on. As far as non-technical hobbies, just in case you couldn't figure it out from Knit Code Monkey, I almost always have knitting in my hands, and I'm like fidgeting a lot up here because I'm wishing that I were knitting. So,
could you knit me a beanie? Like, my head definitely needs one.
yes, and I could probably have it done before the end of this, but you'd have to fetch my knitting.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Stage. No, just kidding. Well, thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause for these panelists. So I have an embarrassing confession to make to kind of get us going, but believe it or not, I've never written really any React Native, and yet I've been invited to be up here. It must have been my charm that got me here. But that kind of leads me to what I kind of want to get started with our conversation today, which is, what are some of the biggest hurdles you have encountered or you think beginners encounter as they come to React Native, whether they come from maybe JavaScript, or as many of you are more native developers, maybe there's a difference there. What are those hurdles? What are things that you think are topics that you find you have to repeat and teach again and again and again?
This is a great one for me.
All right.
I'll go ahead and start with this one. So this is kind of a side project of mine and Gant's, and it's mostly because of the environment setup that comes with something like React Native. So realistically, it's one of the more complex setups that you could possibly have with really any type of development, because it encompasses so many different things. So not only do you have your Android SDKs and the IDE that goes along with that, and then your iOS SDKs, your Node, your NPM versions, and literally millions of different versions of packages. That kind of thing is incredibly complicated to set up, and I cannot even express the number of times I've had to run through someone's environment to figure out what's going on with it. And so that's actually kind of where Gant's and my side library, our side projects, came from. It was actually conversations we had at this conference last year about all the people having trouble setting things up. So you can go ahead and start talking about solidarity.
Actually, I'm just going to say the most amazing aspect of React Native is it's a series of so many diverse and open source tools that come from so many different communities. And the worst part about React Native is that it's a diverse and extremely large list of all kinds of tools to make all these things work. And that's really what, that's how it compounds, right? The cost is kind of hidden. You get the benefits, is like you get to bring in almost any node module, right? But then you get to work with each other, and libraries that you never thought would end up on a phone are there. But at the same time, you're losing 3 hours on a Saturday because the client says, this doesn't work on my machine. And you're like, I know it does. So yeah, and for beginners, multiply by 10.
Yeah, I think I would add to that, because at Infinite Red, you guys have been solving the initial roadblocks with Ignite. And we also try to do something similar with reactnativec.com. There is a problem, with React Native, we don't have a design tool. So we are trying to build BuilderX with that. CallStack has been doing something called Rebolt to get started with ReasonML with React Native. So I think all the companies active in React Native community, they're trying to build their stuff so that people can really get started easily. Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I particularly like what you're saying about all these companies kind of trying to solve the same problem to some degree. I think that's kind of the joy of our industry, right? Like we all approach a problem, we hit it almost at the same time. I remember Darren yesterday talking about how you were at Infinite Red, were solving a problem at the same time Facebook was. With that being said, with all these solutions out there, you've already kind of mentioned a few, but if you were to start a project from scratch, or if you're trying to teach me, a total noob, from scratch, like, where would you start? Like, where do you get started in React Native today? Is it Expo? Is it Ignite? What are these options, and which ones are better? Like, let's hash that out.
Well, personally, I have a very good experience with Expo. I think they make a good job, like to go from zero to having one app that is deployed, and you can concentrate to learn React from the beginning, just JS and that. That's my personal
What about
experience.
that experience is like really positive for you as a developer? What makes that compelling?
In my experience, it's like you don't have to care about like deployment. You don't have to care about like the Android building system or the iOS.
Does that
system.
trip up beginners a lot, like getting all these build systems to work and the different things like that?
Yes, that's what.
All right.
If y'all so quiet, I'm going to keep talking. All right. I would like to say that every project has a really big question at the beginning of it. Is this a project where I need to deliver immediately, fast, reliably? And then is this a project where we can be creative and experiment? So if I need to do something fast, like hackathon style, I'm going to do a different sort of setup. I'm going to do Ignite. I'm going to do the tools that I know a lot of people use and that I can go to and I can feel comfortable. But I don't think that that's a place you should stay. I think that you need to identify a project as well. Is it time to go ahead and try to throw in GraphQL even though you're not comfortable with it? Is it time to try Reason, right? And depending on if it's a conference app and you're really to just do all kinds of crazy and fun things, or if you actually have to, you have a deadline, you have to get things kind of happening, you should have two answers to that, right? For me, it's when we need to make sure it's stable, it's one thing, but I would love to try Reason. I would love to try every single library. Actually, just that's a matter of time at that point.
Let's help Gant live forever so he can do that. Do any of you have any thoughts on where you get started? Or Erica, specifically you yesterday, you talked a lot about how the challenges of kind of having native and React Native apps. And do you have anything that you could add to this? Not to put you on the spot too much, but that's my job.
Sure. Are you asking specifically about starting with a brownfield app?
Even greenfield, whatever you want to go with.
Let's talk about brownfield because I've been doing a little bit more of that lately since we moved over to Kotlin. I think that it's going to depend a lot on how many developers you have on your team and how receptive they are to really changing their build structure. So if you look at just the stock documentation for introducing React Native into an existing app, you're changing what the file tree looks like a lot. All of a sudden, these Android developers clone a Git repo, and they just see index.js in the root with an Android subdirectory. So it depends on, are you willing to do the standard, well-documented path at the expense of creating something that's very unfamiliar for native developers, or do you want to find a solution that makes it a bit more invisible to everyone else on your native team? And from what I've seen, every company that goes that route is doing it a little bit differently.
I think you bring up a really great point that I would love to continue to hit on. We have such a variety here on this panel. Some of you are native to React Native. Some of you are JavaScript to React Native. Are there community differences because of that? Is there just attitude differences? I believe we had a talk earlier that kind of described those differences. What has been your experience going from one way to the other?
So just to be clear, you're asking about sort of a cultural acceptance among native devs. So I've noticed that iOS developers seem to be a bit more receptive, and I think that it's because a lot of them have been burned by Objective-C and Swift.
For good reason.
They don't really like to use Objective-C, and then they were there for Swift's debut, and it was just very buggy and didn't work very well. On the other side, since Google has decided to officially support Kotlin, there's a really nice developer experience right now for Android, especially with all these things being introduced like Room and live data and data binding and all this exciting stuff, so that it's not this old world of crazy old school Java code, tons of boilerplate. So I think that Android developers get that sense of FOMO if they're using React Native. They get that fear of missing out, whereas iOS seems to be more receptive.
I thought FOMO was only for the JavaScript community, so I'm really glad to hear other people suffer just as well. What about y'all? Some of you are JS to native, some of you are native to JS. Any thoughts?
Sure. I came from the JavaScript community. I've been a front-end developer sort of for most of my life up until I joined Facebook, and there was this awesome React Native thing going on, and that was when I got into mobile development. And it was incredibly exciting, but I was also kind of surprised at the difference in the culture as we started working with more and more developers who had spent a lot of time on the native side of things. I feel like in the JavaScript world, we're very happy to be jumping around between lots of different things, and maybe not jumping around is the right word because there is like a lot of pain that we experience from the thrash of the tools that we use, but there's constantly new things coming into the JavaScript world, and we're kind of used to that rapid rate of change. And we're also used to dealing with the fact that we don't have quite as much control over the platforms that we're targeting. So we are targeting web browsers, and they have a wide variety of quirks that web developers have sort of become accustomed to using. And iOS and Android also have these quirks, but they're sort of provided by a single company that has big developer events each year and has very clear messaging. And the developers I feel like, are a lot ready to be to buy into these existing ecosystems, versus in JavaScript, it's been a mess this whole time, and we're just used to it.
How many had to enable 2FA yesterday for their NPM stuff, right? Like.
All right, so I feel like I had a little bit of a different experience than some of these folks here, because I came from the JavaScript and then Cordova community. And so my experience of Cordova was more or less pretty similar to Trashfire. So coming into React Native, I was just super excited for things working right and getting some of the native features that all of my my iOS and Android master race friends decided that was a lot better than anything I had. So I actually get to use Accessibility Inspector and native UI testing frameworks.
Good answers.
It's up there.
I feel like I missed it.
No, yeah, there was a box. Yeah.
I did too.
So that kind of thing, my experience of it was really, really positive, and most of the community around me was Cordova-centered, and since then, literally all of us have gone towards React Native, and all of my iOS and Android friends were super resistant because they saw me like, you're a Cordova dev, what do you know?
I came from a different angle when it came to starting with React Native. Basically, the company that I worked for had decided that they wanted to start supporting their own apps, and they had 2 separate apps. So they basically said, okay, we're going to divide you in half. Okay, you're going to do Android, and you're going to do iOS. And I was on the iOS side. And so, there was like 5 on one side, 5 on the other, and we kept hiring people. So there was like 6, and then 8, and then 10. But by the time we got to 10, I was the only one on the iOS side. Everyone had completely bailed for Java. So, and so here I was desperately just struggling through trying to figure out how Objective-C worked. And it was not my friend. Objective-C and I are not friends. So then I actually floated the idea of, why don't we try React Native? I know it's really new, but I mean, you could do the whole right once and it works everywhere. And everyone got excited about that and jumped in. And we all started working on React Native. And the more we worked on React Native, the more we realized that, write once and work everywhere it's a lie. But
Fallacious marketing.
yeah, totally. However, it still got us most of the way there. We still ended up diving into Android for more specific requirements. We started diving into iOS for more specific requirements. They have 2 different sets of requirements, but the majority of the code was still capable of using React Native, which really basically made it possible for us. We'd fought so hard that, it brought us the ability to be able to create and support those apps.
Awesome.
So I think most of the people spoke about their journey, and I think we need to make a stand today? Like, if you start with React Native today, are there instances where you hit that roadblock of getting to the native layer? So a couple of years ago, I mean, when most of the people in the panel actually joined React Native and started with that, then the scenario was different. But today, I think most of the native library, which is like usually used, are available as a bridge in React Native, so you don't need to get down to that layer.
That sounds like a problem's been solved then. Like
Yeah,
a beginner like me might get lost across that bridge, like literally.
Getting lost across the bridge.
No, yeah, you know, fending off trolls, that kind of thing, right?
That's why something like Expo just provides like such an enormous amount of value. I don't need to tell most of the people in this room, but like Expo will get you there with most of the native modules that you need, and then if you ever need to, you can always eject, but they also have a slightly eject way to sort of add additional native code to your Expo app, but their goal is to just cover all of the native stuff that you're going to need, and they're relatively responsive with these things, so.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I heard you say something in particular that I think I want to like kind of direct our conversation. You mentioned like a lot of the challenge that native developers maybe weren't quite as ready for when they got to React Native was something JavaScript developers were really comfortable with, which is just kind of uncertainty and things changing rapidly, and the browser itself being a challenging environment because it's not as controlled as, say, the phones and other native devices are. So my question to you is, what would it take for browsers to catch up to a point that you're willing to hang up your mobile React Native jersey for good and retire that? What do the browsers need?
I'll take this one. Okay. Am I answering too much? No. Okay.
No.
All right. So
Not
I
at
think the first one would be if the browsers actually gave you native layouts, native elements, instead of like having a renderer of its own. That's the first thing. And then second one, Apple doing more of PWA support on iOS devices so that we can actually ship web apps more like native apps. So I think if these two things are there, then probably.
I need to challenge you on something that I don't understand. I want you to explain. What's the difference between like default styles like buttons and inputs and these native elements you're talking about? I would love some clarity on that.
Yeah. So when we talk about browsers, it's like it has its own engine of rendering.
Sure.
It doesn't actually use the native widgets available. So if you do a view in React Native, it actually compiles down or executes the native UI view on iOS and the view on Android. Nice. But when you do a button inside a browser, it doesn't actually compiles down to the native button. So if browsers provide a way in which we can actually do view and text the way we do in React Native, then probably we can do that. And the second one is definitely more complete support of PWAs.
So to add ever so slightly to that, the side effect of buttons in React Native versus the native state is that it doesn't include the accessibility features that are inherently default within using the native frameworks. So at that point, we're having to add and pile on additional accessibility features to make them function the way that a native format would by default.
Do you think browsers should like do this work, or do you just think this is a pipe dream? I mean, a few weeks ago with Airbnb stuff, which I do want to get into, like I was hearing people say, controversy. Web apps are a way to be cross-mobile and available, right? Like, so is this something browsers should pursue, or are you saying like, they should just hang it up? They should hang up the jersey. What do you think?
I think a merger is inevitable.
Okay.
And I think that that's the key. And I see a lot of people pushing web to be more native, and then they hit some kind of barrier, and so they're pushing from one direction. And in a lot of ways, we load up React Native, and the first thing I like to tell everybody in a React Native class is like, doesn't this feel like web, right? And we're pushing the other direction. I don't think one person's going to have to say, I give. I think that middle layer is going to continue to blur, and sort of we're going to need to find that middle ground. And when you have that, there's going to be this breakthrough moment. But I will not declare, that's like saying, I will not declare what technology will do that.
I wanted to add something about accessibility. We know that we have a lot of accessibility limitations right now. But internally at Facebook, right now we have a new person that she's going to be working the next 3 months to ramp up accessibility for both iOS and Android. So that's going to be open source and share iOS and Android.
That's awesome.
I want to argue against your point, Gant. Yes, yours.
Good.
Accessibility is awesome. I'm absolutely not arguing against that at all. So, but I do want to argue that I don't necessarily think that a merger is essentially inevitable. I think that there's a different use case for a browser than there is for a mobile app. And I think that the more that we dive into the code, the more that we do that, it may be that the languages may get closer and closer, but I think that the platforms and the way that we code them have to be different because the experience is supposed to be different. And with that comes, challenges that are unique to each platform.
Yeah, I think that's very essential. I hate the DOM, so.
Well, so I want to push back a little bit. I'm just curious why the experience is supposed to be different on web versus native apps, right? Like I could browse. You might think that like the web is like meant for articles and sort of content like that link together, but then why does Medium have an app? I feel like it should be one continuum of just good experience apps that might be web apps, might be native apps. That's an implementation detail. That's our problem as an industry to sort of figure out. But as an experience, I feel like they should just all feel great.
Well, but feeling great is not the same as acting the same way. Like we expect something to act differently on a mobile device with no keyboard and no mouse as we do, on a computer that actually gives us those features. So to be able to say that the experience should feel great all the way across, it absolutely should. But the tools that we're using are going to be different. And therefore the experience and how we interact with them is going to also be different.
I'm curious if the tools need to be different or if they just are because Apple and Google are providing native toolkits and they're also providing browsers. And some of them have access to more features than the others. Some of them can do push notifications and be installed via this app store that everyone gets software from these days.
And I feel like the conversation that we're having is two different conversations. So when you're talking about tools, you're talking about software tools. When I'm talking about tools, I'm talking hardware tools. So the hardware itself is different. How we use our bodies to interact with the hardware is going to be different. And with that comes different software requirements. So even if the software tools that we utilize are similar, the hardware experiences have to be different.
I totally agree. But when it comes to web apps versus native apps, I can't see why we wouldn't be able to have all web apps one day if only Apple and Google would ship really great mobile browsers that were as great as their native development environments.
And part of me wonders, something that we've really been trying to do, and I had a great conversation last night about this, was, tying specifically into accessibility, the experience that someone has with our app when they're blind is completely different than someone who can see. Why are we trying to isolate and unify the code to do that? Why don't we make the experience fantastic for the person that's blind and fantastic for the person that's not? And just basically have a toggle that says, okay, well, if you're using these features, then we're going to go down this path. If you're using these features, are you going down this path? And they're two independent, isolated apps. Why do we have to unify them? And I guess my purpose there is that, okay, so fine, we have a web app, but we're using it on an iOS which has certain expectations, or we're using it on an Android device that has certain expectations, or we're using it on a tablet that has larger but still mobile expectations, or we're using it on a browser that has a much larger screen, possibly 2 or 3 or 4 screens that we can push something across. So I wonder if our idea of unifying all of that code into one project is just complicating something that doesn't need to be complicated, where we can isolate it into multiple simple formats.
I agree, and I think that the main thing that we should pay attention to is from a user-centric perspective.
Yes.
Which is to say that if we want to design a really great experience for a blind person, then we should be able to do that. But ideally, we'd be able to ship that great experience on web and native. We shouldn't really have to silo ourselves based on the technology constraints of the environment, so much as what amazing experiences we want to provide to users, all of our users.
Yeah, I just think that you're more likely to walk around as a blind user with a cell phone than you are with a desktop.
Yeah, and based on what you said yesterday, like an iOS device specifically sounds like it's just better for iOS, or an iOS better for blind people.
Essentially, yes.
That's as firm a stance as she's going to take on that? No.
For now.
Do you need to sit closer and continue this?
Sorry.
No, I think this is great. Well, let's get into that. I'm going to T-ball you, Jen, but I've been really intrigued by the talks today, and hopefully you have too the last few days, specifically around like AR and VR, and then your talk on accessibility. And I would love to kind of hear thoughts, not just from Jen, but from everyone, on like how they feel like these new areas of reality that we're going into, how does accessibility tie into that? How does, and things like that, enhancement, enabling, all these things. So anyone can.
Does someone want to start before I take the rest of the hour?
I'll cut you off.
I'll throw a quick point in there. I think that despite whatever situation you're in, I think AR and VR brings this fantastic ability if you're in a wheelchair or if you are just regular Joe. Everybody has a chance to get motion sick all together, and we could be a community.
It's a way to sell Dramamine pills.
So much to unpack. I'm trying to decide which parts I'm going to go for right here. So when it comes to AR and VR, our physical bodies actually pay a lot more, we have to pay a lot more attention to that than we would with any of the other devices. Because when we're on a phone or on a laptop, we have our laptops right here, we have our phones right here. However, when you're talking about AR and VR, we're not talking about our phones right here, we're talking about the world out there, and how our phones or devices are interacting with the world out there. And at that point, we're talking about how our physical bodies interact with the world out there through these devices. Which means if you are 4'10", like my aunt, who says she's 5 foot tall, you are absolutely not going to be able to interact with something that's at 6 feet. And if you're 6'8" and you barely fit through doors, it's a pain to bend all the way down to the ground to interact with something and get all the way back up. And then there are those that are aging. They have knee issues, they have an actual wheelchair. And all of these things tie into the technologies that we're using. There was an argument against someone who said, or against VR headsets, that said that the problem with them is that they're currently tied to the technology. So it was a wired VR headset. He couldn't get it on by himself, so someone had to put it on him, which meant that if there was a fire, he was in a wheelchair and he was tied to this device on this large piece of equipment, and he couldn't get it off himself, and he would be left there in the building. And then how do you take a wheelchair or someone who's older and put them into a VR walking device that allows them to interact for long distance walking? How does that work? So it becomes a little less about the software and a little more about how the hardware interacts with humans.
I actually kind of want to weigh in there, kind of similar to a point that you were saying earlier, talking about the world out here versus your actual phone. So from a developer perspective, that means that your stage, your tableau, is a lot larger. Mm-hmm. And it means that your scope for possibly creating an experience that is not accessible is extremely large.
Mm-hmm. It absolutely is. And I mean, at that point, you're looking at not just making sure that your colors and your symbols allow people with different visible vision issues to be able to see them and interact with them. Like if you're walking down a hallway and the doors that are red are locked and the doors that are green are unlocked and there's like 500 doors, it's going to be pretty hard. You're going to want to add a symbol to that, and you might want to consider that you're going to need to have multiple ways of interacting with the universe and not just the one standard way you're used to. So my aunt, who's 5'10", 4'10", 5 foot, or someone who's 6'8" can both interact and have a good time in this world. And I mean, sometimes you're going to have things on the floor, but maybe you have a setting that allows it to be a little bit higher, or vice versa. Something that's 6 foot tall, make the furniture a little shorter.
I think those are great points. Are there success stories too, though? Like it seems like we're focusing on like what is problematic, and I think part of the reason we're all here is somewhere deep down in our hearts, a lot of us are techno-optimists, right? Personally, I don't think innovation will solve every problem. We create just as many problems as we solve, right? But like, what are some optimistic things that come from the advancements we're making right now in mobile development with AR and VR in terms of helping people around the world? I'd love to hear from everyone. Start somewhere.
All right, fine. So there's a couple different things. Microsoft is actually creating VR software for the blind. So it's actually run on audio distancing software that allows them to identify things that are in the universe and how far they are, what they are, how to use them. And it essentially, in the video that they show, allows them to play duck hunt by walking through a room, finding where the weapon is, picking it up, finding where the ducks are, and then listening as the ducks flew by to identify where they were. So someone who was blind could still play duck hunt.
That's pretty cool. How many of you spent a lot of your childhood playing duck hunt? Right?
Yeah. Other success stories are just the ability to take someone who's bedridden and give them the ability to travel the world.
That's nice. I know a particular story. It doesn't actually go AR, VR, but everybody in the audience, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. And I came from Ruby, sorry, don't hate me. But it was Ruby Motion 2014, and the speaker was, they had a blind speaker, right? And he told the story about how he ran out and bought an iPhone because he could point it at something, take a photo, and it would tell him what color it was. And he was so happy. He went out, got one, came home, and then it was late at night. He's like, oh, yeah, this is great. He's like, oh, this is fantastic. And he points at it, at something. He's like, all right, I know this is blue. Points at it, I presses it, it says it's black. He's like, okay. Then he goes to somewhere else. It's black. This is black. He's like, it's a lie. This whole thing's a lie. And then he's like, wait a second, I'm blind. I don't need lights on. Hold on. And he goes and he flips the lights on. And then he's like, yes, this really does work. And it inspired him to become a developer. So he started actually developing apps. That's awesome. And it's a fantastic, that was a terrible version of it, but thank you so much. But I suggest watch the talks from Ruby Motion 2014. That's one of my favorite stories.
All right. I have a success story actually from my experience with React Native, though it's not AR, VR, but a accessibility success story. So we were using a fully JavaScript navigator in our application, and we found something on Android. Basically, I was profiling the performance, and I turned on GPU overdraw. And the more pages that were pushed onto the backstack, the worse the GPU overdraw became. And I was trying to figure out what's going on here. I looked at it in Android's native hierarchy viewer, and the entire backstack was remaining in the view tree. So when I turned on the accessibility settings, when I turned on the screen reader, if I touched a random part of the screen, it would read me the text from the views maybe 2 or 3 behind it. Yeah, so we realized that this was not accessible for our app, and it's not acceptable to create an app that just completely excludes visually impaired people. So I tried pretty much every React Native navigation system. Who else has done that? Tried every React Native navigation system? Probably a lot of us.
This one built one?
Yeah.
Blame him.
And we discovered that Wix created a fully native navigator. Yay, Wix guys. Which solved our problems with accessibility and also a lot of the GPU overdraw issues. So Ease let me completely rewrite the app to fix the accessibility issue, and that ended up working out great.
That's fantastic. I mean, I heard recently, and I thought this was pretty awesome, but people with just vision impairment, not blindness, but like not being able to read the names of conference rooms. Come on, a lot of us have worked at big companies, and they have the weirdest names. Like, I worked at a company that literally had a map for me. Like, I could log into this map system, and it would give me like GPS directions to the conference rooms I was supposed to go to, you know. But basically, an app was able to tell her, like, visually what she was looking at. She couldn't see it, she couldn't read it, but she could see, oh, this is such and such room. And she's now able to get to meetings without walking into the wrong one and being like, oh, I'm not supposed to be here.
Yeah, I didn't understand my company's conference room naming schemes until I figured out they're all weed strains. So, yeah. So now I know why one of them is called Girl Scout cookies.
For those of you who need to know, you probably already do. It is legal here in Oregon. Just saying. Awesome. Thank you for sharing those stories. I'm gonna change it around. I said I'd bring it back to this topic, so I think it's time that we get into it. A few weeks ago, even I, a lonely JavaScript developer, heard about this news, but Airbnb decided that they're going to leave React Native behind. And so I would love to hear a couple things. Like, what do you make of this? I think there's a lot of things you could say about that. What do you foresee its effects on the community at large? And maybe even given some of the talks today, like, how do you foresee some of the responses to it or some of the work that's already being done to fix the problems that they chose to leave behind?
I'll answer this? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So there's this guy named Cooksey from React Academy. So he posted a very nice tweet, actually a flowchart, which says when to use React Native. So at the top, it reads like, when to use React Native, and there's a decision-making box. Are you Airbnb? Yes, then no. No, then yes.
That's a flow chart I can understand. What were you going to say, David?
Yeah, I'm going to start. So Airbnb described like two big problems. One of them was like pure organizational. And then they have another big problem that was mostly technical with some React Native problems, like breach startup, performance, bugs in the framework. So what Ram presented today is like Facebook is already started working on that. We started working on this early this year, not because Airbnb or anything like that. It's because we experienced the same problems for a long period of time. So we need to fix it for us, and we are going to, of course.
You selfish people, you.
and we are, of course, sharing that with the open source. So we believe that most of these issues are going to be fixed. Of course, there are going to be probably new issues, right?
Sure. You're going to run into new ones, right?
Yeah, of course.
Eric, you were telling me at lunch some interesting things about this. What's some of your take on what's going on data structure-wise and otherwise with that problem?
Well, I think there's probably two high-level issues that Airbnb struggled, and they're going to be issues that basically any hybrid application is going to sort of struggle from. The first is not exactly what you're asking me, but I'll just mention it, is a huge one, is the cultural difference of the fact that there's existing iOS and Android teams who are likely to have resistance to changing the whole way that they work when, if you ask them, nothing's wrong with the way that they work from the beginning. But I think you're right now asking about the technical side of things. And that's,
I'm asking about both. I do think there is a cultural impact to what Airbnb has chosen to do. You don't put out a blog post like that, and I'm going to guess almost the entire 500 people here are at least aware of it. So I think there's a cultural impact. I think you're perfectly welcome to talk about that, and I'd love to get into that.
That's a harder problem to solve than I think the technical things, which Facebook has been working on, and Facebook, of course, as having an extremely complicated hybrid app, has recognized the same sort of problems, and David's one of the people leading the effort in terms of solving it at Facebook and eventually for the whole community. As far as the cultural problems go, this is not such an easy thing to move past. What I like to think about is what are the technologies that are going to be here many, many years from now, right? Like right now, iOS and Android are king, and it used to be that Windows XP was king. And now, what happened if you had an XP app? You had to rewrite it for the web. Now, my hope, my theory, is that 10 years from now, when mobile is just that old boring thing that we were doing before whatever is coming next.
Holograms.
Holograms and AR and VR and wearables and IoT, all of these things. Regardless, we're still going to be able to use the same code. We're still going to be able to ship the same code. Just like how if you have an old PHP jQuery website like that you had developed back in the XP days, like it still works. You can still maintain it if you need to. And if you wanted to, you could have iterated from there all the way to React, all the way to React Native. And if you had taken an iterative approach this whole time, maybe your XP app, once you had sort of moved it onto the web and then had it in the React world and then brought it to React Native, it might even work on iPhone and Android right now. I don't know.
Any Airbnb hot takes on this side of the table?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a hot take, but I mean, I tell this to literally everyone I work with, that compared to working with code, working with people is really hard. And after reading that blog, all I could see was all the personal and cultural issues, and it wasn't necessarily all technical. There are, without a doubt, technical issues with any of the things that we're going to work with. No one has perfect technology except for, some iOS developers. So to me, that was really just an effect of they were trying to do something new and integrate it with something they already had. I never had any of those problems because I worked with strictly greenfield applications. I started a new one. We decided we were going to rewrite our stuff from scratch. And so the problems that they described, I'm like, you're making that up.
That's awesome. Actually, what I would say is very happy they did it. I'm very happy they went and said it, because I think that they were internally struggling, and they needed to go. They needed to sort of pull that parachute, and that might be the right call if you can't work the politics inside your company. You need to sometimes take care of those aspects as well. But the sort of bubble that pops from that and kind of lands directly in the face of Facebook actually helps us all as well, because that conflict, it abets the passion of it, and either you're going to adjust and fix those problems, or you're going to step down. And you hear Facebook see it, and they say, we want to go ahead and be better because of that. I mean, I think that it hurts, but it's growth.
Yeah, I would echo what other folks are saying in the sense that, number one, brownfield is very, very hard, and I think that was my biggest takeaway from the Airbnb blog post, and I don't think that it necessarily applies to greenfield. I'll add on the cultural side, I think it's very, very important for companies who are adopting React Native that they have true cross-functional teams. I think that React Native on mobile makes the most sense for a company that has a front end on React. So, like, for example, we never even considered something like Flutter as a cross-platform solution because we have all this React.js code that already exists. If you do not have a cross-platform or cross-functional team, if I was to go to the web guys and say, hey, I want you to take a bunch of time to re-architect your code, modularize this piece, stick it into a shared repo, change the way that your code works that you're calling the shared repo, and they have a ton of work on their own features that they have to do and bug fixes, they're not going to want to do that. It benefits them in no way and takes a ton of time. And then on the mobile side, you're kind of left wondering, well, what's the benefit in using React Native when I don't actually get to share this code? Sure, I could copy paste it, but that's nowhere near as good as having an actual shared repo that's being maintained in one place. So I think that that's part of the cultural shift that has to happen for companies who adopt that technology.
That's a good point. And to that point, like we had a really great talk yesterday about sharing components among repos. Some of you work in situations where this is something you have to encounter and deal with. What have been some of your favorite strategies of sharing logic amongst different apps and different platforms at your companies and that kind of thing?
Copy and paste.
Copy and paste?
Simplest solution.
Do you have a code gen for like div to view and stuff like that?
No, man, Control V.
Control, that's just enough? Prettier does that too? No, just kidding.
All kidding aside, a current project that I'm working on, it is a giant mono repo, and realistically, some of the points that they brought up in the talk yesterday were really excellent, because even though this is not a React Native application that I'm working in, a lot of the same points are very transferable. So a lot of the shared code idea is separating business logic from the actual view layer, and so you can do that really, really easily with, neat libraries like Recompose, so you can create just the view layer and then export that, and then create that business logic and export that, and then you can reuse it in whatever way you want, composing it in any spot. So a lot of the stuff that I've recently wrote, it would be really easy just to dump that into a React Native app, because I mean I'd have to change divs to views, and that's pretty much it. Even though it's not React Native, it totally could be.
Nice.
Yeah, like talking about like views to divs, we can use React Native Web. We have solutions like React Primitives if you want to share the UI, but that really is a decision on the app or what problem you're trying to solve. But yeah, sharing the business logic, monorepo is a good option. Or maybe publishing your package internally and then reusing it. That's another way of doing it. Yeah, recently announced by Vincent Reamer, the React Native DOM, which can also be used to reuse the UI across web and mobile.
Yeah, and going a little step further from what you were saying, publish it internally. I always try and encourage people, if you're going to reuse something, chances are someone else is probably going to use it too. And if your company does not have any type of open source policy for utilities that you're writing, you really need to talk to them about that, because that type of thing is incredibly useful. The reason why we are so productive as developers is that we can just borrow code from other people.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question there. So you talked about monorepos. Do you use like Yarn workspaces or like something like Lerna?
So our workspace is entirely done with Lerna, and it has a very, very old legacy build system that depends on that. So I've never actually gotten to use Yarn workspaces.
Okay, so does Lerna play well with React Native?
I honestly cannot tell you.
Okay, all right.
As somebody who has messed around with web and React Native sort of side by side for a little bit, I have noticed that one of the biggest pain points recurring time and time again is the difference in packagers. When you use Create React App, you're set up with this fancy Webpack setup that has like all these bells and whistles, but they still have slightly different behavior from how Metro behaves, the React Native packager. And the React Native packager can theoretically be used to build websites. That's what Vincent's doing with the React Native DOM, which I think is a pretty great move. He's got all sorts of cool things like the refresh bar. It'll tell you like, oh, we're at 95% loading this new app, and it's in the browser, which is pretty cool. But when it comes to code sharing, I see there's kind of a few different layers you can do it at. There's the low level where you're actually deciding whether or not you want to use React Native Web or something like React Native DOM. You're going to decide whether or not on web you're going to write your components with actual div and span and CSS, or your favorite CSS and JS solution, which people get very sort of tied to, which makes a lot of sense. So there's the leaf components where you'd be using view and image on React Native. Then there's the sort of application logic. This is the easiest stuff to share right now, because as long as you have a build system that's able to connect your components, you can start sharing this code immediately, right? Like all of your Apollo connected code, all of the stuff can just kind of easily be shared between React Native and web. And then the next kind of layer, and this is kind of a bumpy layer that I've been working on for a little while, is the navigation side of things, where in my dreams, you'd be able to use the same navigation library on React Native as you would on web. And yeah, you need to sort of change the configuration around, and you obviously, especially if it's a desktop web app and a mobile React Native app, you're going to want to have different UI for the header and sidebar and whatnot. But in any case, you should be able to have full URL handling and all of these things. So I kind of see the sharing code happening on these three layers that you as application developers get to decide what you want to opt into. But I would definitely recommend sharing your application logic, because this is where a lot of your code lives right now, and you don't have to give up your CSS and JS solution on the web, and you don't have to buy into this crazy navigation experimental universe. So
that's awesome. That kind of makes me think of something that I was talking with someone recently about, and specifically, we're talking about sharing components and UI and logic and all these things, but I think there's something else. How can we share React Native with like a broader world? Are there like platforms and targets that we're currently not targeting with React Native that you would really like to see come to fruition? Maybe someone else's next open source project.
I have to say, React Native's on Windows. Is really, really well supported. I'm constantly amazed by what Microsoft has done lately. And I remember tweeting at Microsoft, telling them, I'm never using anything you ever use again. You're a terrible person.
A person, because corporations
It's
are
easier
persons.
that way. Yeah. The horns have receded. And now I find myself just surrounded by a lot of things. They've done a great job. I'm a huge fan of what they've done with React Native Windows. I wish that there would be more corporate backings on other platforms that we can say, with confidence, you come to our company and we can assure you that we will build your app on this platform, no problem, right? And if we could get that kind of sponsorship, I think we're looking at a room full of people who would jump on those kinds of projects. If it can be supported at that level, and if Facebook continues to help us decouple the pieces, like taking the number of platforms. I remember Windows kind of had almost an elevated privilege of being listed inside of the CLI, but I think that they've kind of pulled out into an RN config, and then they're starting to like pull bundler out, and we have Hall from CallStack. We have all these pieces where it's getting compartmentalized. So now you get to, the more it turns into Legos, the more we can actually build whatever it is that we can dream.
I personally want React Native Xbox, something like that.
I think you can build React Native apps on Xbox already, actually.
Nice.
I think Microsoft already has some support for that. I'm just dying to have support on Mac OS and Linux in addition to Windows, because like Electron is not that good, and everything is built on it. Like, guys, we have to replace Electron, seriously. This is, come on.
What, you don't have 64 gig of RAM? Come on, man.
I personally would like to see a React Native working in Android Auto. I would like to see a red box in my car. Yeah.
Nice.
But I think what is more exciting for me is kind of like related to what you were saying, is trying to make each of these different platforms, or like the support of these platforms, awesome. I think right now some of them, they are good enough, and we need to move from that good enough to awesome. And I think that's the vision that we need to have.
I agree.
To my surprise, actually, I saw this tweet from Sean Larkin, who is the Webpack guy from Microsoft. So he tweeted that the new version of Microsoft Office, which includes MS Word and Excel, everything, that's written in JavaScript. And I think they might be using React Native Windows or maybe React.js or something, so which is like a very good sign for where the community is heading. React XP, yeah.
Well, speaking of where we're heading, we're about wrapping up time here. So I would love to hear maybe some sound bites from you. What are you like most inspired by right now? What are you most excited about going forward this next year with React Native and native development and all those things? It could be anything.
So for a soundbite, and I'm totally going to mess this up now that it's a soundbite. The thing that I'm really excited about is the fact that we're looking at, 20, 25 years ago, Java was supposed to be the thing that took over the world, right? And it was supposed to connect our toasters and our phones and our computers and our TVs and our lights. And, in the end, it turns out that it's actually JavaScript that's taking over the world. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't be happier. So, at this point, I'm just looking forward to seeing the next level of JavaScript taking over.
The next level of JavaScript is ReasonML, by the way. Just saying. Just kidding. We don't have time for that one. Well, that's the next talk.
I'm the most excited at seeing what Facebook's recently announced in terms of the large-scale re-architecture coming to fruition. So yeah, I'm really stoked about the possibility of a synchronous bridge and whatever else you folks have in store.
That was a great talk.
Honestly, I'm most excited about the most boring parts of this, and it's really just developer experience stuff. So I'm really excited to see React Native and other libraries getting better at solving their own internal issues and making it easier for people to report things. The better information we get in a GitHub issue, the faster we can respond to and actually solve a real problem. And so that's the type of thing that Gant and I are working on. And even though it seems to be too boring for anyone to want to hear about, I'm really excited about it.
If you want to fall asleep, talk to Trevor and Gant. No.
So Erica mentioned that she's excited about this new generation of React Native's technology, but for the past several years, React itself has been going through a very huge transformation, where first it was being rewritten, and then we got a few new features, and it was rewritten in this architecture that allows for a whole new way for React to work. And finally, after many years of the React team's hard work, we're starting to see the results of that. And hopefully this year, we're going to be able to use Suspense and just get such a more delightful developer experience and a user experience with this lack of these flashing spinners everywhere that are just so easy to put into our app right now. I'm so excited for Suspense to ship this year.
I'm very biased with what I do every day, so of course I'm excited about like this new project that we're working on, how that will unlock many functionality for everybody.
That's awesome.
Go weird here. I have a secret love for machine learning, and when Ray Deck was talking, I was super happy. I plan on, over the next year, if I can, helping any way I can to build absolutely useless and cool machine learning algorithms that will end up all over the place.
You drank the Kool-Aid, dude.
I'm excited about how designers and developers actually get on the same experience without actually having them on like two different sites and working alongside on the same project or maybe on the same Git repo or something. Yeah.
Nice. Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us and some of your hot takes and jokes as well. Can we get a round of applause for these wonderful people?